Welcome to the next in the series of Wipe on Pod, Your Place is All Mine, with me, John Goodall, the architectural editor of Country Life.
And me, Clive and John, a visiting professor at Cambridge.
Well, Clive, this week we decided we were going to talk about a city.
Yes.
Bath.
We haven't done this before.
We haven't done this before.
The city of Bath.
Because it's a place, of course, that will be familiar to all our listeners, if not as a place that they visited, then by reputation, this extraordinary thing of a place that really is called a bath because it was a bath.
That is absolutely true. We cannot get away from the Bathishness of Bath. And I think we're going to organise it so that we talk about the baths in the first instance, in the first part of the programme,
Yeah.
and then the second half of the show will be the town itself.
Indeed, and I suppose the reason it's called Bath is because it is unique in Britain as the one place where hot water springs from the ground. There is nowhere else.
That is absolutely, well, that isn't quite absolutely true, because I believe that might be disputed by Buxton. But I don't think Buxton is quite as hot as Bath. I think Buxton is more kind of, I mean, Bath, the water comes out really hot. I don't know if that's the case at Buxton.
Do you know, you
Question
put
mark.
me completely at a stand.
But anyway, never mind. We're principally, in general, I think this is a very good point, John.
And as a matter of fact, both cities, curiously,
I had Googled it just before.
But both cities,
I might not have known.
It's quite interesting. You could compare them both, couldn't you? I mean, Buxton also has very handsome architecture of a slightly later date.
Yes.
Directly related, I'm not really
But
thought
this
so,
is all
but
part of the same phenomenon.
Yes.
These are the only really hot baths. But there were lots of springs and so on, which were, the waters had minerals in them, and people thought that they cured you or ameliorated all sorts of revolting
Things.
diseases.
And, I mean, the Roman name of the
You
place...
had a palsy or a quinsy or something.
But, I mean, the exploitation of it starts, or the use of these waters starts, as far as we're aware, in the Roman period, though there probably is a pre-existing cult at this site.
I should think there must have been, I think. In fact, I think there definitely was, because it's one of these Roman places which is called by a dual name.
Yes.
Because it was, well, they had a pre-existing god figure called Sulis, not quite sure which sex.
Yes.
But she must have been female, because the Romans then tacked on Minerva, because
That's
Minerva
right.
was their one, but they were so good at absorbing pre-existing cults, which made their religion more acceptable. And they didn't seem to mind that this was the Sulis manifestation of Minerva. Anyway, Sulis was a pre-existing one. And this water, I have to say, just to get back to basics, this water comes from the Mendip Hills. As far as I can understand, it's rainwater falling on the Mendips. And the Mendips, in the Cotswolds, only the tops of the hills are limestone. And limestone is porous. And so the water goes down and then it hits a level of, I think, something impervious like clay. And then it bubbles out in streams, which are sort of above ground. But in the Mendips, this core of limestone goes right deep down into the ground, which is sort of extraordinary, because if you think that limestone is made up of all these sea creatures which dissolve in the warm waters when England was somewhere in the Caribbean.
Yes, unimaginably, yes.
Can you imagine how many billions and billions and billions of sea creatures over how many eons of time? Anyway, that always strikes me as impossible to imagine. But anyway, the water seeps down through the Mendips to about 2 miles underground, where it's very hot. And that's what heats it up, because I couldn't think where this hot water was coming from.
And it does come out, I seem to remember the statistic is it's 46 degrees centigrade. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but I mean, it's
hot, isn't it?
It is, I mean, hot, very hot to touch.
I would have thought it even hot to that, because I mean, wasn't it very steamy when it actually comes out of the ground?
It is, and it's sulphurous as well, isn't it? I mean,
Well, it comes out, yes, it comes out a funny colour. It's not pure spring water, it's this orangey colour.
And
so the sulphur is sort of smelly.
Yes, and leaves a stain on all the surfaces where the water runs. I mean, so it becomes Aquae Sulis, doesn't it? Aquae Sulis Minerva, the waters of Sulis Minerva. And also, I think it's just called simply hot water, another Roman name, Aqua Calidaris or something.
Yes.
I'm not
cutting to the chase. I think they got it in one.
They got it in one. Well, just
what a relief it must have been to these poor Romans. I know the Roman army came from different parts of the empire, but can you imagine them trudging across Britain? It's terribly pouring with rain as usual, and then they suddenly find this hot water gushing out of the ground. I mean, they must have thought they're in heaven.
And there is a great deal known archaeologically now about the form of this Roman temple. I mean, I feel very tentative in this because neither of us are Romanists, but I mean, it's when you visit it, it's as Clive, they're very funny photographs actually of Clive and I going there a little while ago. I came across them the other day with both wrapped up very warmly because it was freezing cold in January, but with the waters indeed steaming. But I mean, there's a spring building, and then there's a bath building, and there's a temple building, and the pediment of the temple where the sun and the moon facing each other extraordinarily still survive.
A roundel in the pediment.
That's right.
With somebody with a beard. But is that?
I think it's the sun. I think it is actually the sun and the moon. They were on opposite pediments of the building.
Actually, I think that's right now you mentioned it.
And
it's very well described in that museum, isn't it? It has to be said.
It is these extraordinary bits and pieces that, I mean, we'll talk about this more later, but which, cleared out from the baths, these lead, inscriptions in lead of curses that people threw in the water.
Yes.
Like someone lost a cape and they write a curse on the person who'd stolen it from them and they throw it in the water, these sort of votive curses. And,
we found all sorts of things in there because when people bathe, or perhaps it was particularly the case then, I think it might even be the case now. I mean, rings came off people's fingers and whatnot.
And do you find
so in the outflow, they found quite a lot, I think, in archaeology.
And that was there was a major excavation there, wasn't there, in the I think in the 1970s or 1980s that revealed a huge amount more.
Yes, Barry Cundiff, I think.
That's right. That is right. So I mean, an enormous amount there, and a sort of fascinating insight into also the internationalism of I think some of the bones and things they've been scientifically identified. I seem from there's somebody from Syria who obviously dies in Bath. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yes.
These people travelling huge distances, an illustration of how internationalised the Roman Empire is. I would think,
of course, people have always gone there to get better, but that hasn't always happened.
No, indeed. And Bath Abbey is living testimony to that. I mean, there's no church, apart from possibly Westminster Abbey, that has more memorials in it from a wider geographic area, because everybody is coming there and if they don't make it, they're often buried there. And I mean, it is an extraordinary building. But I mean, the Roman baths themselves, obviously, they're within a covered building, but that seems to...
Yes, they were eventually. I think that, it was covered, but I think originally it had a pitched roof. Yeah. And then I suppose, I don't really quite know when this happened, but was it about 200, say, a great barrel vault was put over this really very large bathing space.
And I suppose the point is that when that collapses at some undocumented time, the baths are effectively buried, aren't they? I mean, that and that is part of the fascination of Bath, because the waters remain known, and
it must have been extraordinary for the people who weren't part of the Roman culture, because these buildings were enormous, really. Well, certainly to people who didn't have that technology at all to build. I mean, can you imagine building a great big vault? Really astonishing. And the whole culture of bathing was amazing to local people. Apparently a local person said to the Roman governor, why do you bathe every day? And he said, because I'm too busy to bathe twice a day. I mean, this was because that was their entertainment. It was their relaxation where they went to. It was like their club where they went to meet friends. It was where you took a bit of a gym. You did a bit of a workout, and you lolled around, and that was your leisure time.
And in the main, you had to do this in places where the water had been artificially heated. But of course, in Bath,
yes,
I did. There's fascinating reconstructed Roman villa in Somerset, where they've created a hot room, and it's rather fascinating because they've done it after classical treatises on how you heat water and so forth. And it does turn out that you can create these ovens, and that if when they take a long time to get up to temperature, but when they get up to temperature, you can more or less feed them a couple of logs every day.
Oh, I see.
And they run for 6 months, and then you have to rake everything
so
out.
they were like kind of continental stoves in rooms, which are apparently incredibly efficient.
That's
in
right.
terms of the amount of fuel. Once you've got them
going, they're so hot that anything you put in basically incinerates itself, and then it just runs and runs. But then the ashes eventually choke it up. It's a rather fascinating piece of experimental archaeology.
Yes, and probably have to spare a thought for the slaves who had to crawl through the hypercourse, as it would have been boys probably.
Well, I think
cleaning it out in there.
The stove in this particular reconstruction I've seen, the stove is actually a completely separate entity, and it feeds through the hypercourse. So you have an oven, and there are vents from that into the hypercourse, of course, being this hollow area under the floor with
supported on built up to tiles where they were sort of little pillars,
which allows the hot air to circulate.
Yes.
But there must be then some other means of heating the water. I mean, needless to say, it was explained to me at the time, but I've now forgotten.
Well,
but
you
this
just would have heated it up. It would have been like an old-fashioned
boiler.
A boiler, which, I mean, those old-fashioned, I was thinking range, these Victorian ranges for cooking on.
Yes.
You could turn levers and heat different things and send the water in different places, in different directions. So perhaps it's like that. I explained it very...
in a very erudite way.
In a very scientific manner.
No, of course, I have to drag the conversation forward a little bit to the Middle Ages, because there is something that is, of course, really fascinating, that that obviously the site of the baths becomes taken over by an abbey, and that there is this connection between two places named after water outlets, Bath and Wells, the bishopric of Bath and Wells. And Wells in Somerset is also an area where the water surges out of the ground in Wells, just beside the cathedral. And it's
not a well at all, it's a spring.
It's a spring, but it's more than that. It's pools of water. It is, but they're very large springs, and the name Wells does celebrate these very large things. And it's a peculiarity. There are two bishoprics in Britain where they're linked together in the Middle Ages. Lichfield and Coventry, and that's a collegiate foundation and a monastery, and Bath and Wells. And Bath was a monastery, and Wells was a collegiate foundation as a cathedral. And they're both very important, and they are... Bath, of course, is encircled by walls. I should say that it still is the Bishop of Bath and Wells. He has responsibility for both places. But Bath develops within a walled city. I mean, it's a really important and significant place, a very wealthy foundation. And that,
of course, it's in a bit of an elbow of the river, isn't it?
It is as well. But I mean... The hot water is known about, but it doesn't seem to be. It's not really clear how it's exploited in the Middle Ages, and of course, it's something that archaeologists generally have not been very interested in. They're much more interested in the Roman stuff. And that is also a peculiarity, I think, of Bath, is that we tend to see Bath as we have it today, and we're interested in how that's created, which is very fascinating. We're very interested in the Roman bit, which is also very interesting. But the bit in the middle is also rather fascinating and is, I think, much less examined and discussed. We do have 17th century and indeed 16th century illustration of the baths. John Speed, when he does his maps in 1612 of English cities, he shows not only the main baths but also this thing called the Lazar's bath, which is presumably for
that wouldn't be what I'd choose.
to choose to swim in.
So that was for lepers.
And well,
I mean, Lazarus is suffering from leprosy. Is that what?
Yes. Well, I mean, though I'm not.
What do you find at the bottom of the tank? Sorry, that's a very great line.
But I mean, no doubt the separation is entirely deliberate.
Yes, of course.
And there's also a very wonderful anonymous drawing, which I think now is at the Bodleian, which shows the baths in the 1670s. And I think we tend to think of Bath as this rather severe Roman, an elegant Roman revival city. But in fact, this in the late 17th century, it's kind of wonderfully zany. All these buildings side by side, cheek by jowl, around the baths. What is called the King's Bath and the Queen, a much smaller Queen's Bath. Everybody swimming, or lots of boys swimming naked, women with their hair in little caps while they swim. Everybody swimming, mixed bathing.
One should say that anything associated with a bath, a bagnio, was of rather dubious repute. And I think this could have been the case.
Though it looks perfect. I mean, in a way, it looks completely. There are lots of. Maybe I am being very innocent. I mean,
well, I think this mixed bathing was a very exceptional activity, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, you didn't really swim in or bathe in.
No, or
this
take your
way.
clothes off in the presence of other members of the opposite sex.
But the other thing that's interesting about this, what we know about the form of the baths is, of course, that they have these structures within them and these strange names. So there's the parlour, which is an area underneath, a kind of little turret in the middle of the water. The King's Bath, the Queen's Bath, the kitchen, I seem to remember, is another area of the baths.
Was it related to the monastery in any way? Do you think?
I think that the baths...
These are just nicknames that they got.
I mean, it's really hard to know. And presumably there is a continuity of use, and there must be some relationship between all these things. The Lazarus bath, as far as I'm aware, leprosy is not a problem in 17th century Britain.
Right.
So you imagine that is actually a later... It's an earlier name somehow. I don't actually know. What is
this Lazarus? Is it related to Lazarus?
Yes, exactly.
So it's somebody rising again. Was it somebody who was really at death's door who then miraculously got better? I don't know. Anyway, question. But we could spool back just slightly, because before the Middle Ages, it's worth considering, and there were two things which happened. There was a battle just outside Bath, the Battle of Durham, which was lost in the mist of time, but in the 7th century. But that pushed the Britons lost and were pushed further west, but that possibly had quite a destructive effect on Bath. And the other thing was that Bath was burnt by a bishop in the time of William Rufus.
That's right.
So both these things might have had a destructive effect, which is why in the Middle Ages the vault of the Bath had collapsed by then, hadn't it? The vault,
and it must have completely buried.
Yes, because it was huge. It built out of sort of concrete. It really is extraordinary. There are bits of this vault which are by the kind of reconstructed Bath. It's very fascinating, but you can see how enormously heavy it was. And so, as you say, it would have collapsed into the Bath. And so these medieval baths weren't actually the Roman bath, because it was actually lost. The source, they didn't know where the source of the spring was. And so people bobbing around in this water, there was water, but...
And this becomes very important subsequently, doesn't it? Because it's what...
to my 19th century story.
It's exactly the 9th century story of the city.
Just wanted to lay the groundwork here.
And it's worth saying too that one of the great sites of Bath, I mean, we've already mentioned it, is Bath Abbey. That it begins to be rebuilt in the very early 16th century, in this incredible interior with magnificent fan vaults. I mean, some of them are actually much later, because the Abbey building is dissolved before the reconstruction is actually complete. But the King's Mason is involved in erecting these high fan vaults, these wonderfully ornate and intricate vaults over the choir, which are then copied in the 18th century further down, and that the west front has this wonderful pair of ladders with angels ascending and descending from
Jacob's
heaven.
Ladder.
Yes, built by this bishop called Oliver King, who and his sort of punning reference to his name is carved on the front. It all contemporary with Henry VII's chapel in Westminster. So a really fantastic building, and crammed with monuments to deceased people who've died, in Bath. In many cases, coming there for the benefits of the waters. And I don't think there's any other church I can think of that, other than Westminster, which not only has such a concentration of funerary monuments of predominantly from the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, but also where the people recorded are so often from so far afield. This isn't
Yes.
like a cathedral where you have the gentry of the county and the nobility of the county being buried. This is really people from all over the country, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit more later on.
Yes, and that was an incredibly important aspect of the whole Bath phenomenon, that people came from everywhere, either because they wanted to take the waters and they wanted to have some condition improved, or because they were attracted by the social thing and the taking of the waters was slightly secondary. But there was a great mixing up of people. And, of course, you didn't really know who anybody was because you couldn't check them out. So that was an important aspect of Bath from a sort of social point of view. But can I just ask you, the Jacob's Ladder was before the dissolution?
It is, and so the ground plan of the new church is laid out. But
I think it became a very important... it became a sort of Laudian device, but also has nothing to do with that. Because I remember that, at least I think I do, I could be wrong, but in East Noyle, in Wiltshire, where Christopher Wren's father was rector,
Yes.
I think, the rector had the care of the chancel and he decorated it.
Plasterwork, there's very rich plasterwork.
Which includes, I think, because there's a lot of reference to things going up and down, like incense. It was the connection between the world and the heavens occupied by God. And I thought to take Jacob's Ladder with angels going up and down. Anyway, that is a complete red herring, and I could be wrong.
And there are magnificent 17th century doors of Bath Abbey. That's another thing which are created by the bishop, which must be just pre-Civil War, which that would tie in with that by this.
But it's interesting that the monastery, given that monasteries were very good at exploiting economic potential and everything, it didn't really make much of the baths, did it? The baths weren't that big in the Middle Ages.
Well, they're not that big, but I find they clearly are known about.
You might have expected a monastery would have been onto a really good thing with this bath.
Well, that's why the monastery is where it is, of course.
Oh, well, yes.
Do you see? I think it's
but I would have thought, given that they were very, very good at exploiting saints when they had them and pilgrims, they might have encouraged people to, they could have monetized this a bit. So they seem not to have done a great deal.
Well, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that this simply hasn't been a focus of attention in the same way. That people look through the Middle Ages slightly because they,
And you think they were doing it?
Well, I think they were doing it, but
okay.
I just don't think there has been the same level of interest in how that's been exploited.
Yes.
But that also becomes apparent, I think, because of what you said. If you imagine the bathhouse collapsing, that the way in which the Roman buildings are still clearly there are lots of Roman remains, but they're sort of overlaid. The Abbey is clearly plonked right on top of where the baths are. That can't be a coincidence.
No, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I don't think it doesn't make use of any. What's underneath the Abbey? It doesn't actually make use of any pre-existing building, does it? It's just that's where it is. It's next door to the bath.
Right next door.
Right next door. Could be more next door.
And it is. It's I suppose so difficult to know now because so much has been reorganised and changed.
Yes. Well, I suppose that's a witness of the fact it's been used so intensively because of the baths. And there are all these. There's one called the cross baths, isn't there? I think rather an elegant little building.
Well, it is, and it is very complicated because there's been such large-scale redevelopment of the baths. And the baths today sit where you would expect the cloister to be.
Yes.
There's nothing left of those buildings. What's interesting, of course, is that the Abbey Church has survived, and indeed until the 18th century, I think the nave was actually a 17th century. The nave is a ruin because the roof is never put on and the monastery is dissolved. The church itself is preserved and admired, clearly, but the monastery really is pretty much effaced. And it is this fascinating thing that it is part of a dual cathedral foundation that links these two water features. You couldn't make it up. No. It's a very strange thing.
Of course, listeners will be wondering what happened to the source of the water and how it was that it got lost and how it was rediscovered. Isn't that the question they'll be asking themselves, John?
And which they will have to find out the answer in the next part.
No, we must tell them now because we're going to talk about this. We get to talk about the town.
We
at
had
the
the
next part.
cliffhanger. Okay, go on.
Okay, well, I mean, this is an extraordinary story, which I'll keep as short as I possibly can. But I mean, I'll be challenged. Anyway, in 1871, there was an architect, city architect of Bath, was a man called Major Charles, I think it was, Davis. He was actually obviously a very, very difficult character. He was a major in the sort of territorials or something, and he kept these large wolfhounds which used to bite local tradesmen and stuff. And instead of having them put down, he had one sent out of the county so that they couldn't be pursued. I mean, he was obviously a rather tricky customer. Anyway, one of his duties as city architect was to find out why there was a leak. The water from the King's Bath was seeping away. And obviously that was bad news for the person who owned the King's Bath, because if it was seeping away, the bath wasn't being filled up, and therefore you couldn't get as much money from it. So he started to undertake an investigation. For different reasons, it took a bit of a time. But this involved sending builders to crawl through a Roman drain, which had originally been sort of quite biggish, I suppose. But anyway, it had... well, I suppose it was big enough to crawl through, but in parts it had collapsed, so then it wasn't very easy to crawl through. And so these builders set off down this drain. I mean, it must have been terrible, because it got to a point where there's a steam coming out from the source of the spring. So it must have been very, very unpleasant. Everything had fallen down. So he started to look for the actual source of the water. And one of the things he did was to drain the King's Bath. Oh, that's right. But he did it originally in 1871, and then he stopped because they wanted it back. But a few years later, in the same decade, the city, well, was it a city then? Not sure it was. Anyway, the town authorities acquired the rights to the water, so he could then do it properly, because the city, he didn't have to worry about the owner complaining about his water being taken away. Anyway, this always strikes me as being slightly revolting, that they excavated 20 feet of sediment and sort of silt at the bottom of this bath, because you can imagine that everybody bobbing around. I mean, the water was never changed. I mean, it was never completely changed. It filled up, and
they just dug out this enormous depth of sediment.
Yes, all the Lazarus fingers which had fallen off. But I mean, it seems extraordinary that people were bathing in this space which had never been cleaned out for centuries.
It's a bit like a river, isn't it? I suppose.
Yes, I suppose that is true, and because the water was sort of percolating into it, and then
disappearing, flowing off.
Yes, there would have been some sort of outflow. But Davis succeeded in finding the source of the bath, the original source of the Roman bath, and had all that excavated. He dug through the ground he was rather destructive of the King's Bath, which we probably would have quite liked to have seen a bit more of. But he dug through the bottom of the bath, and they began to excavate Roman bath. It seems extraordinary that, until the late Victorian period, this had been lost. And it was good in the Victorian period, because the great age of the spa that we were talking about, when this had been it was a sort of place where people went to take their holidays, rather well-off people generally, because not many people could afford to take holidays, but they would go to these spas for a bit of rest and relaxation, recuperation. By the 1870s, everybody was going to the seaside, and so Bath was rather falling off. And so to make this discovery was actually a good thing for the economy of the town.
It is also, I just feel confronted by my own ignorance when I say this, but of course, one of the big shifts is that in the 18th century, as a spa town, there are spas like Scarborough where people swim in the sea, but actually in the 18th century and the late 17th century, presumably going to Bath is more about drinking the water, hence the water fountain in
the pump room.
In the pump room. And so there's actually, I think people still do bathe, but it's less significant. So what you're shown going...
Yes. Well, of course, it is very interesting. It is. People drank this revolting water. But there were loads of baths, of course, one should say. Bath its name suggests, it was the most important, but, Llandrindod Wells and Cheltenham and all these other...
Knaresborough.
Yes, I mean, they were just all over the place, but, I mean, the ones on the seaside...
But they're all spas, aren't they? But they're not all...
They're spas, yes.
But they're not all bathing places, are they?
No, actually,
many of them
course,
are
I suppose
just...
that would be true.
They're just drinking places. Though there are places such as Scarborough where you swim in the sea too.
But I think these ones were on the seaside were unusual.
Yes. Well,
because he didn't... I mean, at Scarborough, you were swimming in the sea, or Margate was an early one too. But you weren't drinking the waters. I mean, there wasn't a spring, was there? I don't think.
I don't... Well, I mean, I don't know why
they particularly went to Scarborough, or indeed Margate, except that it was easy to get to from London. But, there were... I mean, Buxton was another one which we've mentioned. I mean, there were really a lot. Sort of every... I mean, there must have been tons in Cornwall, I should think, because there are lots of wells. But that's... Anyway, they then had to have a competition. They had to work out the kind of... how to present Roman Bath to a new public. And it became part of a competition. They wanted to have an art gallery, concert hall. They wanted to cover the baths again because this vault had fallen down. And they also wanted to do things like build a size courts to the town hall, which was an elegant 18th century building. And they had a competition. And Major Davis was rather disgruntled at having to oversee this competition because he thought that as the city of Bath, it should be his. Well, or at least he thought that this was a rather infra-dig kind of activity. And besides, if he did do it, then he couldn't enter the competition. But extraordinary things happened, John. This is an amazing story because they had Alfred Waterhouse, who was a really big Victorian architect. He did the Natural History Museum and many other things, to be the judge of the competition. And the people who entered this competition, this was the usual form, did so anonymously, obviously, so that it was a fair competition. And they put letters on their submissions. And Waterhouse chose one which was, I think, K, and one which was O. There was then, this sort of thing happened in these competitions. There was then a sort of confabulation amid the council, and they overturned it, and they made O the winner and not K. Then there was a big meeting of everybody in Bath to open the envelope and find out who O was. And they opened the envelope. And what do you think they found?
Yes,
this really is a cliffhanger.
Oh, all right. Ah, yes.
No, but what was in the envelope?
Part 2. So, part 2, and a genuine cliffhanger, as Clive wishes to reveal what was in the envelope O.
Well, you will be astonished, John, to know, if you've forgotten the article I wrote about it in Country Life, that there was nothing. The envelope was empty. But this caused a lot of embarrassment to Major Davis, because there should have been his business card.
Yes.
And what this man had very naughtily done was he had got into cahoots with a sort of perspectivist from the Isle of Wight who was very good at making drawings. And although he wasn't meant to enter this competition, they'd got together, and the drawings, which of course, needless to say, came just sort of in the nick of time, were going to be handed over, or were handed over, at Waterloo Station. And he had borrowed an office which belonged to the station master. Anyway, there they were, and the chap from the Isle of Wight handed over the drawings. And Davis had in his hand the envelope. It was getting a bit dark by this time. And he took out his card. He saw a card on the floor, and he assumed he had taken out 2 cards, and he dropped one of them. But he'd actually...
dropped the very card that he was meant to put inside it.
So, I mean, can you imagine what a cock-up?
But so then what happened at the end of this? I mean, is there no doubt the town authorities then turn back. What they
Well,
they go back on their decision, no doubt.
Well, I mean, he had obviously, I mean, his design was terrible. And so he shouldn't, I'm amazed that Waterhouse would have chosen it even as the second design. But maybe he thought, well, it doesn't really matter. These local people are putting pressure on me. But clearly Bryden, who was the one who eventually built everything, who was a really good architect by Edwardian, really sort of associated with...
Was he the other entry that Waterhouse had initially chosen?
As it were, and yes.
So they reverted back
to
the
did,
original
because
river.
It was obviously a bit of a scandal. And besides, it was a nonsense, because Bryden was clearly head and shoulders above Davis. Davis was not a man to give up lightly, and he sort of got as a consolation prize the design of a hotel. And you see it, if you come along to the station in Bath and walk into the city, you see this hotel right in front of you. There's a long walk as you go along.
That's right, yeah.
Before you get into the 18th century part. And Pevsner, I think, in his Buildings of England volume, calls it a monstrosity and an unspeakable example of incompetence or something. He really doesn't have a good word to say for it, and rightly, because it's a sort of terribly kind of overloaded sort of building, and that was Davis's chef-d'oeuvre.
What's interesting,
Bryden got the gig, and he built they ran out of money. He wasn't able to cover the Bath, which I think was probably a good thing, because it's now open. And as you walk around Bath, everybody can see it. You don't actually have to get into the Bath. I mean, it's a very good museum if you do, but, it's become part of the experience of seeing Bath. And he also extended this rather elegant town hall, and you might question whether he didn't make it a bit Edwardian, which he did, but then he had to add these extra things that people needed because Bath had grown so much.
I mean, it's also very atmospheric. I do remember, I think on that same visit I mentioned before in January, in the cold morning, sort of steam from the bars rise up,
greenish water.
But I mean, it looks like when you're walking in the centre of Bath, it's basically an enclosed wall. I mean, it shields the baths from you when you walk around it.
On top, isn't it?
That's right.
Roman Caesars.
And it is a second attempt, isn't it? It feels almost absurd that we've talked about the Roman bits, the present day bits of Bath. That's how you experience the Bath today. But for many people, Bath is the bit in the middle, isn't it? It's the 18th century remodelling. And I suppose what you've described is in some ways a compliment to what happens in the 18th century, where Bath really changes shape and assumes the form that the heart of the city is, or not just the heart of the city, but the main 18th century streets, create today.
Yes,
I mean, and that
I think there are two bits of very good luck which Bath had. One, and characterised by two people. Well, one is the fact that it did have this person, but firstly, Ralph Allen, who owned the quarry. Because the quarry is just outside Bath, and it produces this lovely, lovely stone. And
Bath stone,
indeed, which is this beautiful golden honey colour, isn't it? Yes. And so different colours and different lights, but often called honey-coloured. And so this was used throughout Bath and gives this wonderful unity and this beautiful stone. And he was such an interesting man, Ralph Allen. He himself was great advertisement for Bath. He'd done very well from getting a sort of monopoly on the postal service.
This is in the early 18th century, we should say as well.
Yes, we should. Yes, it's in the early 18th century. I'm sorry. Let's face it. And he built a big house called Prior Park outside Bath, and he was quite a magnet for people. He was a friend of Alexander Pope, the poet, for example, and he had this beautiful picturesque garden.
Which drops down to the city, doesn't it? Which sort of frames...
very striking landscape, and Pope was terribly interested in that. And so he was a magnet for people coming, and perhaps, he got talked about. But the old prince of Bath, and I used to have one myself until a builder stole it, show the wall of Prior Park, Ralph Allen's house, and just on the other side was this sort of railway. It wasn't pulled by engines, I bet, pulled by horses or mules or something, but just outside the park itself was this railway to take the stone down into Bath, where his Ralph Allen's friend, John Wood,
Of Bath, yes.
of Bath, who was an
Senior.
architect. Yes, John Wood the older was building all these wonderful terraces that he did.
And Alan is attempting to make these quarries that he has as popular as possible. I mean,
Yes.
nobody knows of Bath stone before he begins
No.
promoting it, and so I mean, it's a really interesting piece of
Well, it was a
self-promotion.
really interesting sort of synchronicity. What's the word? Where you had two organisms.
Synergy. I don't know. It's a really annoying word.
Two organisms which are mutually dependent. Anyway, it's that sort of thing because, the architecture and the stone.
Symbiosis.
Exactly so, John. These two operations go hand in hand, don't they? The stone and the architecture.
And I mean, we should introduce John Wood, Senior, as well. Because,
Yes.
I mean, he's such an important and extraordinary figure that he's born. So John Wood, I think he's baptized in Bath in, I think, 1704. And he he seems to have been educated in the local grammar school in Bath. We know very little about his early interests. Was
his father a builder?
His father may have been a builder,
Yeah,
but
I think he might have been.
He turns up in London and is involved with figures such as the Duke of Chandos. He becomes a developer in London, not very successfully. In fact, one of the things that's really intriguing about him is he's completely incompetent as a builder, in fact. But he gets into lots of trouble with his developments, not all of which go at all well. But in the 1720s, in 1725, he comes back to Bath and begins what's called Queen Square, which his proposal is to develop a square just outside the medieval walls of the city, which the medieval walls, of course, have kept Bath very compact and quite chaotic, I think. And he creates Queen Square, and this is the first of a whole series of developments that he planned. He has incredibly grand designs in his mind for what Bath could be, and these are informed partly by his antiquarian interests, and he wants to lay out Bath as a great Roman city, effectively, with
Yes.
a forum and all these grand squares. Bath, for those who've not visited, of course, has a very bizarre topography, which you've already talked about in relation to Brow Park, with these very steep
Yes.
hills around it. And his designs, basically, which are then continued by his son, John Wood, the younger, confusingly,
Yes.
include all the famous streets that we
Yes.
think of today, the Circus, the Gay Street, the Crescent, the Royal Crescent, which is done largely by his son. So, they between them sort of conceive all these, they conceive. Well, they don't conceive the idea, but they develop the idea that if you stick lots of buildings together, you can create houses together. You
Architectural
can
form.
create a palace.
Yes, something which is more than the sum of the parts.
Indeed.
But John, I mean, was this a question of build and they will come? I mean, he had these great schemes for Bath, but as you were describing, Bath until that point had been very higgledy-piggledy.
Yes.
And I wonder, I think people like Queen Anne went to Bath because she had such terrible gynecological problems, having had all these, terrible history of miscarriages and things. But was there a great pressure of people visiting, and that's why he had to build them? And
it becomes
it seems
that.
extraordinary that
Yeah.
he had this vision of how did he know it was going to be popular?
I suppose it is the case, isn't it, that there is, in the late 17th century, this sudden explosion in waters. And as I say, I don't know, you think of Tunbridge Wells, you think of Scarborough, you
Yes.
think of Knaresborough, that there, and Buxton, as you've spoken about, that there is a desire to have these waters, and it's largely people, I think, pursuing their good health. They're not swimming in all these places, but in some places
Yes.
they are. And that Bath is conveniently placed, and that by creating a genteel environment, its success feeds on itself. You need,
Yes.
just like Tunbridge Wells, you get
Yes.
a royal visit and it suddenly becomes Royal Tunbridge Wells.
Yes,
And more
yes.
more people want to go there. So I think...
But still, Wood, it was terrific that Wood had this vision.
Yes.
Before, he might be a man of great confidence.
He was clearly, I think he has, it's thought he had asthma. He's quite irascible. He certainly treated lots of his rivals with a sharp tongue. He has very eccentric views about classicism. I mean, one of his most astonishing projects in the middle of his career is the reconstruction of Llandaff Cathedral, obviously, just over the other side of the Severn estuary from Bath. And Llandaff was a medieval church, obviously, and he completely rebuilds it as a Roman temple. And that in the 19th century, then subsequently, all his work is then suddenly completely stripped away. So it looks once again like a medieval church. Oh. But what's really interesting about his work there is he writes both about Bath and also in the context of Llandaff. He writes down all these rather strange theories about the history of Bath and the history of architecture. And one of these things is, one of the themes of this is that in the divinely revealed designs for the Temple of Solomon, you have a divine architectural form, and that Roman architecture and things that are effectively bad copies or slightly distorted copies of this original divinely ordained series, kind of architecture, and that therefore what he's trying to do when in rebuilding Llandaff Cathedral in this way is to try and to turn it back into a primitive temple in the form of Solomon's Temple. I mean, it's a very odd argument. And of course,
but a kind of very elaborated argument, isn't it?
It's a very elaborated argument. And in the context of Bath, of course, famously, he looks to places such as stone circles, including Stonehenge. Of course, Inigo Jones had thought that Stonehenge was an Ionic temple, not Ionic, a Doric temple, I think. And so he conflates all these things together and creates a new style of architecture that is, or not a new style of architecture. He thinks he's sort of evoking all these, divinely ordained ideas in classical architecture.
Yes,
I mean, it seems fantastical, but of course
it's also very aware of the myth of Bath that it was founded by somebody called Bladud.
Indeed, which is who
was a bit like the prodigal son. He wasn't a prodigal son in that he ran off to be dissipated, but I think he did get leprosy. He got something, and that's why he had to leave. And then he was going around, and he was working as a swineherd, he was working as a swineherd because he was in the woods, in the oak woods, and lo and behold, there was a spring bubbling out of the ground, which he dipped himself in, and he was cured of whatever he had. And that was Bath. That was how the springs of Bath were discovered. That was the legend.
And yes, the legend. He's a completely invented figure. I think people. This is also a sort of fascinating thing, isn't it? That John Wood's interest in antiquarianism is reviving stories that actually have a much greater longevity. He doesn't invent Bladud. Bladud is a figure invented in the Middle Ages, and the baths before their reorganisation, and you can still see the figure there. The figure of King Bladud presides over the bath, and the King's Bath has the sculpture of King Bladud, and that sculpture does actually still survive.
Yes,
but this location of or creating legendary foundations for the story of a city is really important, and it's one that he takes on.
But one of his great designs is for the circus, because he takes these geometrical forms and he builds a circus which is circular.
Yes.
And it's like the Colosseum, but inside out, because the Colosseum is circular and has 3 rows of columns on the outside, and this circle has the 3 rows of columns on the front of the terraces, which was on the inside of the circle. But on top are what you might, if you looked casually, take to be urns. But they aren't urns. They're acorns, because there's a reference back to King Bladud and his pigs and the oak trees.
Yeah, it's a very
it's a very funny
thing, and it's a combination of we would.
I suppose he sees it being as being national. I suppose he wanted, he didn't want to be too foreign. He wanted to show what he was doing as being appropriate to this country.
but was something that also struck back to ideas of Solomonic architecture and divinely
absolutely.
ordained architecture and order.
Yes.
It is, I mean, I seem to remember that Tobias Smollett writes a very funny in his novel Humphrey Clinker. He writes that one of the characters writes a slightly mocking account of Bath. I think Smollett is actually a friend of John Wood's, but he writes this slightly mocking.
Yes.
One of the characters says, that Bath has all these strange figures of geometry appearing, all over the city, and that there are every form of geometry is going to be represented soon. I mean, it must have been. I mean, one thing that comes back to your question about whether it's answering a market or creating it, and I suppose it must have been doing both.
Yes.
Is that the very character of Bath, I think, must have been quite unlike that of any other city. It is basically a city of visitors. I mean, of course, there's a local population, but the whole thing is a sort of stage set for rituals of taking the water, for people travelling and socialising, from across a very, very wide area. It's a very strange, an unusual environment, I suppose.
Which was also organised, wasn't it? Because, of course, there was a master of ceremonies.
Indeed.
Who organised and told people how they could behave, because people were these people who didn't know each other and came from all over the place had to meet on kind of grounds of equality and not have fights. Gentlemen had to leave their swords outside the assembly rooms.
And you needed someone
in case there were terrible arguments.
But also in a world where suddenly society was so large and so potentially mixed, you had to have someone who arbitrated over who it was appropriate to meet and the terms in which you met complete strangers, which is not...
And not everybody, you had to be dressed in a certain way to be let in, didn't you? It was regulated.
It's highly regulated.
Yes.
And I mean, there's a timetable to taking the waters in the pump room and all these things. I mean, there are times when you go to... when it's the right time to be there. It's
an age in which being polite was very important, wasn't it? To behave in what they termed a polite manner, which was according to society's norms, I suppose.
Yes, and it's
which were practically written down.
But it must. I mean, the analogy of everybody coming together is sort of paralleled, I suppose, in London for the season in this period. But in London, there's a much greater existing population, and people had their own permanent houses. And in Bath, everybody's renting everything.
Yes, I wonder whether that was what Wood built these houses for, to be rented out. Or whether, that was something which came later.
No, well, I think that they are rented out, I think, pretty clearly from the first. That it is a place... that you visit. I mean, famously, of course, Jane Austen's novels, they exactly capture this sense of, they have characters, of course, who are unwell. They have these mixtures of people, this sense of a society where, people come together and they don't necessarily know one another very well, that there can be interesting connections which are going on behind people's backs because it's a place that draws everybody.
Lots of people on the make
together. It isn't,
well, of course, it's rather symbolised really by the architecture, because what Wood did was to design the facades of buildings. I don't know whether he actually built them. Did he?
I think he's such an incompetent. He's not a very
incompetent builder that maybe other people built. I think perhaps you just took. I mean, basically, it's not unlike the area that we're in at the moment, which is Pimlico in London, which was much later. Yeah. But it's basically, I think, the same principle, that you took a design and you had to conform to this design. I mean, he must have been very rigorous, because these set pieces, like the circus and like Queen Square, there is no non-conformity to the design. The design's absolutely rigid, but that's the front of the buildings. And you could do what you liked at the back. So when you walk around the back, that is all kind of different shapes and sizes.
It is also...
So you had this public face, which is tremendously ordered and
then the back
regimented and disciplined, whereas the back is completely sort of tumbled down. Well, not tumbled down, but a jumble.
It's also interesting, isn't it, that, I mean, John Wood, it should be said, John Wood had much more ambitious plans than it ever realised. He wants to build a forum and all kinds of things. These things never come to fruition. But there is also a very interesting shift, I think, in aesthetic between father and son, that Queen Square and the Circus, they're all inward-looking designs. Yes. And what's very interesting is that John Wood the Younger, when he comes to build the Crescent, it's actually an outward-looking structure. It looks out over the landscape, and it's a sort of picturesque creation. And that's a very interesting shift
in sensibility.
In sensibility and the character of Bath. And
because the Royal Crescent is a very, very imposing piece of architecture, isn't it? I mean, it's a very broad crescent and very tall, but it's also, we talked a bit about the topography with these hills. Of course, Wood the Elder was able just to build on the flat bits, suitable for valetudinarians. But as time went on and Bath expanded, they got more and more up the hill. And the Crescent was taking advantage of the fact that Wood the Younger was building at the top of the hill, which people had to make an effort to go up to get to. But then once they were there, they could have these terrific views. And the land which is going down the hill in front of the Crescent was a garden. It still is, isn't it?
It is a parkland. It is, I mean, Bath also, I think, focuses our attention maybe disproportionately. It is really interesting. I don't know what the dates of all these different things are, but of course, places such as Exeter also has, in the 18th century, this wonderful square developed just outside the walls. Bristol, again, also has a square being developed. And whether these are follow-on things from Bath, or actually whether they're possibly happening concurrently, but that there was never the additional development to make it seem actually distinctive of the place. It's quite an interesting question because, there is, I suppose, one school of thought that puts Wood the Elder as at the vanguard of a whole development of urban architecture and something distinctive of English design.
Yes.
But I mean, it is possible that it's sort of slightly more complicated, but we think of him first because, there's so much. There's so much more at Bath and it's so much more fully developed.
I suppose that is the thing about Bath. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of it. And it developed on a big scale and it developed sort of everywhere. And so down by where the Severn is are streets which are a bit smaller and where people like Herschel, for example, the very interesting person who was the astronomer and came to royal notice, but actually he was in Bath because he was a musician and he was an organist. And he held concerts because there were all these people wanting entertainment. But people like him had these smaller buildings near the river which tended to flood. So, but anyway, the point is that there was a huge number of streets and buildings, and in a style. I mean, Wood wasn't the only one. There was this wonderful man called Strahan who managed to get a bit of a look in, and he was slightly more Baroque. He did these. I mean, they look, basically the same form, but he had these door cases and window surrounds, which were much more kind of frilly, for want of a better word. So they're quite striking in this, what's otherwise quite a severe city. But, I mean, there is essentially one style, and it's classical, after the Middle Ages. And it's very consistent, because it all uses the same stone. So it's remarkable from, it gets advantage of critical mass over the others.
And that sense of uniformity as a source of beauty is quite an interesting one. I mean, it's something, again, Edinburgh, you think of the new town, that we I think we often adulate variety in architecture, but indeed there is something very magnificent about the uniformity that Bath possesses, both in stylistically and its materials.
Yes, actually, it's the point that Ben Pentreath makes about building houses today, that actually people quite like repetition. And repetition, well, because, if you think of Edinburgh New Town, another model city which is very coherent in terms of style, nobody is saying they want more variety because they actually like the repetition of something which is good, which is then varied by having a church at the end of the street, or a public building, or a column, or whatever it might be. I apologise for the collection of the recycling that is taking place outside.
Bath also has been the object. I mean, in the 1970s, there was a real conservation battle, wasn't there, over Bath. I seem to remember that Ian Nairn, the architectural critic, was very involved in trying to protect Bath from what he saw as the attempts of the council to destroy elements of the historic layout. I mean, it is quite an interesting...
It's difficult to believe. I'm not quite sure what was under attack in the 70s. I mean, more recently, there have been the bits sort of around the station, which I think would have been, probably warehouses and things of that order.
Yes,
which were being redeveloped. But it's very difficult to imagine that any of the Bath terraces could have been under. But perhaps they were in the 70s. It was a different age.
It's also worth saying is that there is a proposal at present about the Bath Rugby Club, and it's something that we've published, in Country Life. These, this proposal put forward to actually build a sort of classical.
I know, what a great idea!
stadium.
That would be so thoroughly in the tradition of Bath, were it to happen. I think Mark Wilson-Jones is the
architect behind it,
But John, just to spool back to John Wood the Elder, what we didn't mention was I think that the thing which is very remarkable, and I don't know. I mean, it is true that one was slightly brought up to believe that he was ahead of the game. He might have just been part of a whole wave, and, perhaps we're giving him too much credit. But is it the case that these terraces that he did, you see, they were displayed as though they were palaces? So all these individual houses were joined up and then given a great big pediment and columns in the middle.
Yes.
And then two what looked like pavilions at the end. But, of course, actually these were all big houses, but they were all individual houses, but they'd got this critical mass and were being displayed as palaces. Now, that really was quite a new idea.
It is, but the first you do...
Not that they were terraces,
no.
But they were made to look like palaces, because Inigo Jones didn't do that.
Well, I was about to say, I think that there is a question as to whether, in fact, John Wood is very influenced by Covent Garden, which is Inigo Jones's 17th century, designed, and that is given a sort of formality by the church that dominates the square.
But there wasn't this idea of them looking like palaces with pediments and pavilions.
No, no. This is one of the things that he's credited with as having, conceived a way.
Yes, I'm now doubting that it could have been him, but because you said he's so incompetent and such a nutter.
No. Well, he's not. I think we're too dismissive, indeed, of his mad theories. I feel if you're going to enjoy the architecture of the past, you have to make the mistakes. You have to understand those mistakes,
yes.
And it's a very difficult.
It is perfectly true. We forget all about his slightly non-conforming ideas that he had. But they were part of the man.
And they're part of the man, and they're part of the period. And
you
think how difficult it would have been to know anything meaningful about Roman Bath in the 1720s. How on earth are you meant to even begin to engage with the history of a place like that? There's nothing that you can turn to. So I think you have to take it very, very seriously, and clearly these are very strongly held ideas, and like all foundation myths, they're somehow self-reaffirming. They give such a clear answer as to why things are the way they are. Why would you ever give them up? It's only because you test those ideas that they are shown to have weaknesses, and when there's more information. So, in a way, it's very satisfying. His ideas give Bath a kind of coherence intellectually and historically and architecturally that, of course, when we know more, it lacks.
Yes.
So, I think it's easy to underestimate how appealing that kind of approach is.
And we have a lot to thank him for.
We certainly do.
What a wonderful place it is.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Do visit our website, www.wiponpod.com. There you can sign up for a newsletter which will keep you informed and in touch. Our next episode will be about the exuberant country house Senno Park in North Norfolk, a wonderful building of the Edwardian period, which is still privately lived in. Hope to see you next week.